Behind closed doors at the White House, Donald Trump is drawing up a list. Not a list of enemies, but a list of allies he believes betrayed him. Allies he now intends to punish. And Canada, the country Trump once wanted to turn into America's 51st state, is watching from across the border, wondering whether it is about to be rewarded or destroyed. What is unfolding in Washington right now is not just a dispute about NATO. It is the single most dangerous moment for Canadian sovereignty and economic survival since Confederation. And what happens in the next few weeks will determine whether North America, as we know it, still exists by the end of this year. On April 8th, NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte walked into the White House for a meeting with President Trump. The atmosphere was toxic. For weeks, Trump had been raging at NATO allies for refusing to send military forces to help reopen the Strait of Hormuz during the Iran war. Germany refused. Spain refused. Italy refused. France denied the United States access to its military bases for airstrikes against Iran. And Trump was finished pretending that everything was fine. In an all-caps post on Truth Social immediately after his meeting with Rutte, Trump wrote, "NATO was not there when we needed them, and they will not be there if we need them again. Remember Greenland, that big, poorly run piece of ice." White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt went even further, stating the president views this as a test and NATO failed. She called it sad that NATO turned its backs on the American people. But here is what most people missed. The punishment is already being designed. The Wall Street Journal reported that the White House is considering a plan to physically relocate American troops away from NATO countries deemed unhelpful and station them in nations that supported the Iran war effort. Riots confirmed that Trump has discussed pulling some of the more than 80,000 U.S. troops currently stationed across Europe. No formal orders have been issued to the Pentagon yet, but the conversations are happening at the highest levels. On Thursday, April 10th, Axios reported that experts are warning Trump can break NATO without ever formally withdrawing. He does not need to leave the alliance. He just needs to hollow it out from the inside. Stop answering calls, ignore Article 5 commitments, move troops to countries that do what he wants, and keep everyone else guessing. Now, here is where Canada enters this story in a way that changes everything. Canada is a NATO member, a founding member since 1949, but Canada did not send combat forces to help Trump in Iran. Canada did not send warships to the Strait of Hormuz while the fighting was active. Prime Minister Mark Carney urged all parties to respect international law and not target civilian infrastructure. He called the war a failure of the international order and positioned Canada as a responsible middle power. And while Canada has said it would be willing to help secure the Strait of Hormuz during the ceasefire, it explicitly refused to join the war itself. So the question Trump is asking right now is simple. Is Canada on the helpful list or the unhelpful list? That question matters far more than most people realize, because the answer does not just affect military relationships, it affects the single most important economic negotiation Canada will face in the next decade. The CUSMA trade agreement, governing nearly $2 trillion in annual commerce between the United States, Canada, and Mexico, is scheduled for its mandatory review in July, just weeks away. The U.S. Trade Representative has already said it is unlikely all issues will be resolved by the deadline. Trump himself has called the deal irrelevant and suggested the United States might withdraw entirely or break it into separate bilateral agreements with Canada and Mexico. If the review collapses, Canada enters a period of rolling annual reviews, creating permanent uncertainty for every business, worker, and industry that depends on cross-border trade. Given that roughly 75% of Canadian exports go to the United States, permanent uncertainty is the same as permanent economic damage. This is why what is happening inside NATO right now is not just a European problem. It is a Canadian problem. Trump does not separate military loyalty from economic rewards. In his world, everything is connected, everything is a transaction. If you help me in Iran, you get better trade terms. If you refused, you get punished. That is how he operates, and everyone in Ottawa knows it. Yet Carney is playing an extraordinarily complicated game, one most Canadians do not fully understand. Over the past year, he has dramatically increased Canada's defense spending, investing in Arctic capabilities partly to address Trump's constant criticism that Canada cannot defend its northern borders. In March, Carney attended a NATO military exercise above the Arctic Circle alongside Germany's Chancellor and Norway's Prime Minister, watching troops on skis and snowmobiles simulate defense against a Russian threat. He has positioned Canada as a serious military partner in the Arctic, the one region where the United States genuinely needs Canadian cooperation. NATO just announced a new mission called Arctic Sentry, a multi-domain operation involving space, cyber, land, sea, and air defenses designed to counter growing Russian and Chinese activity in the high north. This mission was negotiated directly between Rutte, the Nordic countries, Denmark, and the United States after the Greenland crisis earlier this year. Canada's geography makes it indispensable. You simply cannot secure the Arctic without Canadian territory, waters, and cooperation. And Trump knows this. But Carney is playing both sides of the table simultaneously. On the military front, Canada is threatening to reconsider its $28 billion purchase of 88 F-35 fighter jets from the United States. Ottawa has already paid for 16 of the aircraft, but the Carney government has floated the idea of partnering with Swedish manufacturer Saab to produce Gripen fighters and global eye surveillance planes in Canada instead. This is a deliberate signal. Observers in Ottawa and Washington see it as leverage. One prominent Canadian columnist wrote that Canada should offer to buy the full fleet of F-35s, but only if Trump drops all tariffs on Canadian imports and returns to the terms of CUSMA. That is how you negotiate with a transactional president. Put something on the table he wants and make him pay for it. Then there is the China card. In January, Canada reached a limited agreement with Beijing to lower tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, in exchange for China reducing duties on Canadian canola and other agricultural exports. Trump was furious. He threatened a 100% tariff on all Canadian goods if Canada pursued a free trade deal with China. Carney carefully responded that Canada was not pursuing a free trade deal, that the agreement was consistent with CUSMA, and that Canada was simply resolving specific trade irritants. But the message to Washington was clear. If you keep treating us badly, if you keep slapping tariffs on our steel, aluminum, and automobiles, we have other options. We can move closer to China, diversify, find new markets. Canada has another weapon most Americans do not fully appreciate: critical minerals. The United States is desperately trying to reduce its dependence on China for the rare earth minerals and metals that power everything from electric vehicles to advanced weapon systems. Canada sits on one of the largest reserves of critical minerals on the planet, right next door. The Carney government has deliberately withheld signing a standalone critical minerals agreement with the United States, preferring to keep it as a bargaining chip in the CUSMA negotiations. Foreign Affairs Minister Anita Anand said publicly that any deal must be in Canada's interests, and that Ottawa wants to maximize returns. In other words, Canada is not giving away its most valuable strategic asset for free. So right now, as of today, this is where things stand. Trump is building his punishment list for NATO allies who did not help in Iran. Canada is on the borderline between helpful and unhelpful. The CUSMA review begins in weeks. Canada has multiple leverage points: Arctic security, F-35 purchases, critical minerals, and its relationship with China. Both leaders are engaged in the most complex and consequential negotiation between the United States and Canada since the original free trade agreement in 1988. But there is a wild card nobody is talking about enough: the 2026 U.S. midterm elections. Democrats are fighting hard to retake the House of Representatives, and several of the most competitive races are in Michigan, a state whose economy is deeply intertwined with Canada. Trump's tariffs have crushed cross-border trade in Michigan. Canadian tourism to the United States has plummeted because of the hostility. The Detroit News reported that the drop in Canadian visitors is measurably hurting Michigan businesses. Trump's threat to block the Gordie Howe International Bridge connecting Windsor, Ontario to Detroit became a political liability for Republican candidates in Michigan, who went conspicuously silent rather than defend it. Democratic candidates in Michigan are now actively campaigning against Trump's aggression toward Canada, arguing that it is destroying jobs and economic opportunity in their own state. This is a pressure point. Carney understands deeply. He was a central banker. He reads economic data the way a chess grandmaster reads a board. He knows the domestic political cost of Trump's trade war with Canada is starting to hurt Republicans in competitive districts. And the closer the United States gets to November, the more leverage Canada will have, because Trump cannot afford to be seen destroying jobs in swing states while trying to help Republicans hold Congress. What happens next? Here's the most likely scenario. Trump will not formally pull the United States out of NATO. The 2023 law requires a two-thirds Senate vote for withdrawal, and he does not have the numbers. What he will do instead is hollow out America's commitments selectively, move troops away from countries that opposed him on Iran and toward countries that helped, use this as leverage against every ally including Canada in every future negotiation, and tie military cooperation directly to trade concessions. For Canada specifically, the CUSMA review will almost certainly not produce a clean 16-year extension in July. The most likely outcome is a kick-the-can scenario, where the three countries signal that negotiations are ongoing, but neither renew nor withdraw. This triggers annual reviews, creating what trade lawyers call a zombie agreement, not dead, but not fully alive either. Canada will continue to be shielded from the worst tariffs on CUSMA-compliant goods, but sectoral tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and lumber will remain in place as ongoing U.S. leverage. Carney will try to use the ceasefire period in the Middle East to demonstrate Canadian willingness to help secure the Strait of Hormuz in a limited, non-combat capacity, earning goodwill without committing to the war. He will continue investing in Arctic defense to make Canada indispensable to the Arctic Sentry mission. He will keep the F-35 decision hanging as leverage, and quietly continue building trade relationships with Europe, Asia, and even China as a hedge against American unpredictability. But here is the deeper truth neither leader wants to admit publicly. The old relationship between the United States and Canada is over. What Carney declared as a rupture at Davos was not rhetoric. It was a diagnosis. The assumptions that govern North American relations for 80 years, shared values, shared interests, a shared commitment to rules-based cooperation, have been shattered. What is being built in their place is something transactional, conditional, and fragile. A relationship where military support is traded for tariff relief, critical minerals are withheld as bargaining chips, fighter jet purchases are used as political leverage, and the threat of moving closer to China is a negotiating tactic rather than a genuine strategic shift. This is not the North America anyone imagined a decade ago. This is something new, unstable, something that can break at any moment if either leader miscalculates. Trump is betting that Canada needs the United States more than the United States needs Canada. Historically, he has been right about that. 75% of Canadian exports go south. The Canadian economy was built on integration with the American market. You cannot rewire that overnight. But Carney is betting on something different. Time. Time for Canadian businesses to diversify. Time for Arctic infrastructure to make Canada indispensable. Time for American voters to punish Republicans for the economic damage of the trade war. Time for the world to realize that the United States under Trump is no longer a reliable partner for anyone, and that countries positioning themselves as stable, rule-following, trustworthy alternatives will ultimately win. Who is right? That question will be answered in the next 90 days. The CUSMA deadline, the NATO reshuffling, the midterm campaign, the ceasefire negotiations.